Hey, welcome back to class, everybody. Our semester is starting to wind down. I think we have like about another 2 weeks to go. It's been an absolute pleasure being with you every Monday and Wednesday. I appreciate the opportunity to keep teaching. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to continue on with our discussion on hyperpronation. And hyperpronation refers to not only too much of an angle of pronation, but too much of like a duration of pronation. So what's supposed to happen is as your heel hits the ground, your knee is going to bend, and that's going to force pronation. It's a functional anatomy thing. Like when your knee bends, your feet internally, your tibia internally rotates, and your foot falls into pronation. But then as you extend into your stance phase and just before your swing phase, your leg straightens. And as you straighten your leg, your tibia is going to externally rotate, and that's going to force supination. The problem comes when you are extending your leg into your just before your swing phase, and your foot is supposed to be supinating, but it's still pronating. So that's going to cause like this great torsion in all of the tissues in your lower leg, and that's going to be a potential mechanism for injury. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and we are going to just continue our discussion of hyperpronation and the potential side effects of hyperpronation and then potentially causes of hyperpronation. So last class we talked about this functional anatomy. Now, functional anatomy is like how does the anatomy function and how does one part of the anatomy change the way that another part of the anatomy works. So here we have this knee extension. When I extend my knee, when I straighten my knee, all right, the bones and the bony articulations cause my tibia to externally rotate. So this is as I'm going through and finishing my stance phase, and my foot is about to leave the ground and start on its swing phase. My knee is extending and my leg is externally rotating. But if I have hyperpronation and I'm still pronating, when my leg is extending, then my tibia wants to internally rotate. So how can my tibia externally rotate and internally rotate at the same time? Well, I mean, it's not supposed to, because if I have an external rotation and an internal rotation, there's going to be like this opposite twisting of my tibia and all of the ligaments in my ankle and my knee. So I don't want that. So remember, the hyper in hyperpronation doesn't only refer to too much, but it also refers to too long. So I have too much of an angle, but I also have too much time spent in my pronation pattern. And if I have too much time, then what I have is like that symphony is off. The music is going to sound muddy, or this prolonged time spent in pronation is going to affect other things down the line. So the hyper in hyperpronation doesn't just refer to too much of an angle or an amplitude of pronation, but it refers to disrupted timing. And that disrupted timing is going to put extra forces on certain tissues. So let's just take a look really at what's supposed to happen. Stance phase here starts when my heel hits the ground, and swing phase here starts when my toe leaves the ground. And you'll notice that in stance phase, where the slope of this line is negative, implies pronation is occurring. So I hit my heel on the ground, my foot is falling into plantar flexion, and then as a result of that, my foot rolls into pronation. Then this is about as like in mid stance, as my body is up and over my foot, I start to extend my leg. extend my leg to toe off. And then as I start to extend, my foot is rolling back to supination. Then at toe off, my foot continues to go into supination just a little bit because I'm like finishing my push. I'm completing the push. And then as my foot is swinging through the air, it rolls back into a bit of a pronation. So this is like almost hypersupination here. And it goes to like more of a normal foot fall, which is a little bit inverted, a little bit, all right? And then what happens is the foot hits the ground again, and the ground reaction force forces the foot back into pronation. It rolls back into supination, falls back into pronation just a bit, and hits the heel again. So every step this happens. And you'll notice that pronation here is coupled with outward or inward rotation. So my heel hits the ground, and my tibia and my femur, which are connected, they rotate inwards. Then at mid stance, the opposite happens. And there's this particular timing. And the timing of my tibia and femur, they're not random. You can see they almost follow the exact same pattern as each other. And that pattern there is the opposite pattern of what my foot is doing. And this is like a symphony that has to happen. But what happens if this timing is off? Well, if the timing is off, then all of a sudden we have a potential for injury. This is a mechanism for injury. So when you hit your heel on the ground, this is your contact phase. This is as you get to your center of gravity is above your foot. Now you're like still, that foot is on the ground, and right here, your toe leaves the ground, and you swing your leg forward, getting ready for your next bout of activity. And you can see underneath this line is pronation. So I hit my heel, my foot goes into pronation. Now my foot is flat on the ground. I'm still pronating, but then towards the end here, you can see I start to supinate. As my heel lifts the ground, I'm still supinating. I still supinate all the way until about heel or toe off. And then as my foot swings and my leg is propelling through the air, it gets ready for my next heel strike, and it forces everything into pronation. So the question is like, does the brain control this? Or is this something that happens for free? And I mean, we have things like the ground and gravity, and we have Newton's laws. So when your heel hits the ground is going to do something to your foot. And what that something is, especially if my foot hits in a bit of a dorsiflexion and it hits a little bit of inversion, what the ground does is it forces there to be this motion in your foot. So when you hit the ground at heel strike, you hit on your heel, and you also hit a little bit towards the pronation, towards the lateral side. And what the ground, by pushing up here, is going to do is it's going to create a torque. It's going to create a torque that moves your foot down to the ground, your toes down to the ground, but it's also going to create a torque that rolls your foot into more of an eversion or a hyperpronation. That's the ground doing it. That's not necessarily the brain doing it. But what happens here if, like, the sole of your shoe is worn down? What happens if the ground itself is curved? Like when you run on a track, in the corners of the track is banked. But what happens if I only run to the left? Well, then my left foot is always going to hyperpronate, and my right foot is always going to hyperpronate at a bit of a different angle. And that's actually not, my left foot would hyperpronate, my right foot would supinate. So now all of a sudden, like, what are the impacts of different environments, different surfaces, different shoes? And this whole interaction here doesn't take place 1 or 10 or 50 times a day. It's supposed to take place 10,000 steps per day. I mean, according to our fitness apps, our Fitbits. So what happens if 10,000 times a day, the force of your body weight is not dissipated or absorbed effectively because of one reason or another? So my friend Gail Monahan, she took a look at two different groups. All right, now let me maybe try to explain what the 4-foot varus means. Let me try to draw this a little bit. So your leg comes down like this, and this isn't going to be perfect. Please don't judge all my drawings and stuff. But this is your foot here. This is your tibia. This is your tibia. This is your fibula, and then you have your bones here. I mean, I'm not a specialist in bone structures, so. But when your foot lies on the ground, I mean, or lies flat, your heel is going to be, I don't know, in back of all of this stuff, but then your foot is going to lie so that your toes are like this. And this is your big toe here. And then you have your phalanges here. Now, your rear foot is this section here. And your forefoot is this section here. And for the forefoot large group, rather than the foot like falling flat, what she had is she had people sit on an exam table, and she took pictures of their feet. And the fronts of some people's feet, let me try to draw this picture here. The fronts of some people's feet had an angle that looked like this. So like this angle here was slightly tilted down. But then other people had an angle that was much more inverted. So you had one group that had in their forefoot, one group had in their forefoot, in the front of their foot here, they had a moderate inversion. So that would be this group here. Everybody stands or sits with their foot somewhat inverted, like this, like this. But this group here, if I just drew this picture here, this foot's inversion would be like this, really steep, sorry. This foot's 4-foot inversion would be really steep. Then other people would have less of this inversion of their forefoot. So some people's would maybe hang like this. This was the medium group, and this was the large 4-foot varus. This is called a varus, an angle of angle, whatever. One second. Who does this to me in the middle of everything? Who does that? Who does that, Jose?
Definitely a mom.
Right, definitely my. I appreciate it. I agree with you totally. All right, hold on. Let me get back to putting this thing together. I got to stop the share for a second. Then I got to go back to the share. Definitely my mom. Yo, chill. All right, so what Gail noticed was, and it's not even a heel thing. It's not even a rear foot varus. What she does is she studied this 4-foot varus, a 4-foot moderate group and a 4-foot large group. So the individuals who had this large angle of inversion in their forefoot, that was one group, and the other one was more of a moderate. Moderate is like normal or average or whatever. So if you notice this large group here, I'll try to outline it. The large group here is this graph here. This is the upper end of the graph. And it goes here. Watch out for that dark area. That dark area is the other part of the graph. And the other part of the graph, maybe I'll even just keep highlighting, don't rush. So this is that large 4-foot varus group here. Just makes it easier to understand what's going on if I highlight it like that. And then you'll notice the other graph is underneath it. All right, the graph for the moderate forefoot varus is under here. And that goes up here. So you can see that it's a little bit different here. And it finishes off here. So we'll just take this here. You can see it comes underneath the other graph. They're not exactly overlaid on each other. Now let's just show what it says, all right? It says this is eversion and inversion. Inversion is supination, so supination, and eversion is pronation. So down on the graph is pronation. And you'll see that this group, this 4-foot large group, which is the light colored graph, the 4-foot large group has this little area here, that is below that yellow graph, this little portion here. And you'll also notice that there's a portion here that happens afterwards. Now remember, further this way means time. And further downwards equals more pronation. So this here is more of the angle. And remember, when we talked about hyperpronation, it's not just pronating through a greater angle here, all right? It's also staying in that hyperpronation pattern for a longer period of time. So not only is this individual forced to go through a hyperpronation angle that's greater, but what that's going to do is that's going to force that tibialis anterior to go into its length tension relationship that overextends the length of that muscle and makes it so that the muscle can't provide the active contraction and the passive component of the muscle has to take over. So when the foot pronates into a greater angle, it's going to put a lot more tension and a lot more pressure on the passive component of that muscle. But remember, your tibialis anterior doesn't have a ligament at the top. Doesn't have a tendon at the top. The tibialis anterior attaches directly to your tibial plateau, right? So, or your tibial, the crest of your tibia, rather. So that's going to put a lot of pressure on where the muscle meets the bone, and that's potentially a precursor to medial tibial stress syndrome or shin splints. But you also have a situation here where your pronation is happening for too long a period of time. Not only is there more orange downwards, but there's more orange here to the right of this green graph here. And what that implies is that the hyperpronation is happening for too long a period of time. So what should be happening is as my foot starts to extend, I'm in the middle of my stance phase, as my foot starts to extend, I should be starting to roll into supination. But right here, for this group that has a large 4-foot varus or a large 4-foot angle, what happens is, although the leg is extending and the leg is trying, or the tibia is externally rotating, and it should be forcing supination to happen, what's happening is the foot is still rolling into hyperpronation. And what that's going to do is that's going to take and this is just going to be a very quick drawing, but that's going to take the end of your tibia and your fibula here, and you have the bones of your foot here, and then you have your toes and such, right? 1 toe, 2 toes, 3 toes, 4 toes, and you have your big toe. And what that's going to do is, although your foot wants to be externally rotating towards this direction here, it wants to be rotating towards your toe and supinating towards your toe, your foot is still pronating in this direction. And that's going to cause a great torsion. Torsion is one torque in one direction and another torque in another direction. I mean, that cannot be good for the ligaments, tendons, muscles, and bone of that foot. All right, that's going to definitely push those tissues into their plastic region. All right, so let's get to the next slide. Let's clear all this stuff here, clear all my drawings, and go to the next slide. So you have somebody who's running, and obviously this foot is now hyperpronating. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but if you watch people, and you don't just watch them for the Gucci belt that they're wearing or for the hairstyle they have, but you start watching walking mechanics, you'll see a lot of interesting things happen. One of the reasons why is because of shoes or because of the surface that people run on. You know, there's other reasons for having too much pronation or too little pronation for that long. All right. Now, it could be because you have something like different genetics, right? It could be a genetic thing. It could be that these medial tendons, the tendons on the inside of your foot here, are weak, or they're more stretchy, or less stiff, or they're longer. And if that's the case, the structure on the inside of your foot is not going to be strong enough to withstand that ground reaction force. It could be because your ligaments have already been sprained, and if you've already sprained your ankle, it could be the case that these tendons and ligaments that hold your ankle together are just weaker and a little bit longer than normal. It could be the fact that your foot is a little bit wider, and if your foot was wider, there would be a greater distance from the axis of rotation to where, say, for instance, the foot hits the ground. So this is rather a better spot to put this. The ground reaction force is going to hit here. There's a line of action here of the ground reaction force. There's a distance here to the axis of rotation. So that's going to create a torque that's going to roll the foot into pronation. But if your foot is wider, it's going to make it so that this distance is bigger and the potential for greater torque rolling into hyperpronation is higher. So some people, and I guess for lack of a better word, races or ethnic groups will have different foot structure. For instance, people from an Asian population have a little bit of a wider foot structure, and that makes it so that they're going to have a little bit potentially more ground reaction force, and if that torque associated with ground reaction force, and that's going to make it so that their foot mechanics change. It could also be because of an environmental change, like the angle of a track surface or something like that. And when you're only running around in one direction on the track, and the track is angled, what are the impacts of that only one environment on the way that your foot is going to interact with the ground? There's got to be something. Also, it could be shoes, and we wear all sorts of different types of shoes. What is the impact of having a high-heeled shoe on the way that your foot interacts with the ground? It's got to be severe. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't wear high-heel shoes, all right? They're awesome. But at the same time, high-heel shoes has definitely got to impact the way that this thing is occurring. All right, which is why, and now I've never worn high-heel shoes, but I would assume, Jasmine, when you do wear high-heel shoes, it's got to make walking much more difficult, and it probably makes your calves sore and your body potentially sore, especially if you've never worn them before, because every single muscular interaction has to change. There's no way that this hyperpronation and pronation pattern of walking can occur without proper shoes. Or you could be on something like a trampoline. My guys do a lot of trampoline, but you see that the trampoline bed bows. There's a huge angle here. There's a huge angle from the other side. That has got a force. You can see this foot is almost into full pronation here. So sometimes in the gym, kids will say, my foot hurts, my ankle hurts, my knees hurt. And people say, okay, well, why don't you take it easy on impact and go to trampoline? Well, are you causing more of a problem by introducing an environment or some type of surface that's going to allow for even more pronation? even though you might be taking what you think is impact off of the leg structure of that gymnast, are you really causing more of a problem because you don't understand the physics of what's going on? All right, so let's go back here. Now, what are the issues associated with something like hyperpronation? Well, first of all, you could have medial, or the inside of your ankle. You could have some bone deformation, because if you're walking on the inside of your ankle, then what you're doing is you're increasing the pressure on this side, and you're also increasing over here is going to be, this is a bend. This is a bend right here. So on this side of the bend is going to be compression, but on this side of the bend, and we'll just do compression like this, all of the material is compressing inwards. But on this side of that material, that Achilles tendon, there's going to be tension. So you're loading these particular tissues differently. And because of that, you're also potentially making it so that now there's more torque associated with your foot rotating in that direction because of the ground reaction force. And that's going to put all of these bones and ligaments on the medial aspect of the foot under increased pressure, increased stress. And what that could potentially do is push it into the plastic region. All those tissues, all those bones, and you may even have you may potentially have, let's get back to that. You may even have a little bit of deformation, or the changing in your bone structure itself, along with this stretching of the inside of the foot, ligaments and tendons, which is only going to make it less stable and more potential for ankle sprains and things like that. With the internal rotation of the foot associated with hyperpronation, but the external rotation of the tibia and the fibula and the foot associated with knee extension at toe off, there's going to be an increase in the stress on the ligaments of your knee, because your tibia is supposedly rotating inwards, but your femur is rotating outwards. So that's going to put a lot of tension on the structures that support your knee and your ankle. All right, and furthermore, it's going to put some more forces on the muscles and potentially lead to shin splints. But there's another thing that we want to talk about, and we already talked about it this semester. We talked about poor patellar tracking. So let's go take a look at, here's your femur, here's your kneecap here, here's your tibial plateau. All right, here's my tibia here. And remember, we have my tibial tuberosity is right here. And that tibial tuberosity is attached to a patellar tendon. And that patellar tendon should be, and let me just change this to an arrow, that patellar tendon should be pulling in this direction here. All right. Now, I also have my vastus medialis and my vastus lateralis pulling in this direction. And if these two muscles are pulling somewhat equally, then let's just add these two vectors together here. You should have one added vector that looks something like this here. All right, this blue one is my added vector of my vastus lateralis and vastus medialis. And because these muscles here are relatively strong, like the same strength, they're going to pull my patella in this direction, promoting a positive, or promoting, I guess, a correct rather, translation of my patella in the vertical direction. But now we have another problem, because if my tibia is internally rotated like that, then this patellar tendon is no longer going to be straight up and down. It's going to also pull the patellar tendon towards that direction. So if I can erase this right here, now all of a sudden we have a situation that might look like this, where this patellar tendon is now pulling in that direction. All right, what that's going to do is that's going to put constant tension on my tibial tuberosity here, and that's going to lead to potentially Osgood-Schlatter's disease, which is an overgrowth of that tibial tuberosity because there's too much pull, constant pull on the tibial tuberosity because of that patellar tendon. And we know that a bone, like a tibial tuberosity that's under increased tension, increased pressure, is going to overgrow because of Wolff's Law. All right, so now all of a sudden we have a mechanism for knee pain associated with hyperpronation. All right, we also have potential for Achilles tendon pain associated with hyperpronation, and that's the beginning of Sever's disease. So there's lots of potential issues that can occur. Now, not only that, but as my tibia internally rotates, remember your tibial internal rotation is coupled with your, right here it says rotation of my femur. Right, as my tibia internally rotates, so does the upper bone in my upper leg. And that bone here, because of the attachment of the femoral head and the femoral neck, changes the way that my pelvis is going to rotate. And because my pelvis is connected to my vertebrae in my lower back, it could be the case that hyperpronation is going to cause lower back pain, or a change in the way that my iliopsoas muscle fires. And if that's the case, all of a sudden we have a potential for sciatica. And if I do have change in my pelvic orientation, that causes a lordosis in my lower back. That's going to follow all the way up the chain, and it could make it so that I have, a neck that's more flexed, and if that's the case, more tension in my neck extensor muscles, and that might potentially lead to headaches, migraine headaches, upper back pain. So now, all of a sudden, because your foot is constrained to your tibia and constrained to your femur and pelvis and all the way up this kinetic chain, the impact of your foot mechanics and your foot structure and the tissues of your foot 10,000 times per day could have huge impacts on the rest of your body. Now, a lot of times you see people who have reasonably good shoes. But what happens if you see individuals who have, for instance, shoes like that? And although I understand that Uggs could potentially be warm and cool to wear, when they get to this point, that's not cool anymore. Or when you take a look at somebody who is doing construction and they have, steel-toed boots, but the steel-toed boot they've been wearing them for so long, and their heel, the heel of the shoe is actually worn down so that the outside of the heel or the inside of the heel is so worn. Now, take a look at this. This is interesting. If you notice very slightly here, let's just draw this heel very slightly, very slightly. You notice that the heel goes here. And let me just outline this here. Now, when I notice this heel, this person is supposed to be walking, and as they hit the ground, it should be the outside edge that hits first. And then because the ground reaction force hits the outside edge first, it's supposed to roll the foot into pronation in that direction. But if you look very, very carefully here, all right, it looks as though there's more wear on that side of the foot than on this side of the foot. Meaning this here is thinner than that, slightly. I'm going to erase all of that stuff. And it looks like there's more wear on this side of the foot. So it seems actually like this person is now standing, and it looks like when they hit the ground, it could be hitting here. And if that's the case, rather than the foot rolling into pronation like it should, it seems like here the foot would actually roll into the opposite direction, into supination, as the ankle is and the foot is interacting with the ground. That is going to severely disrupt this whole situation here. right? This whole situation is now totally disrupted. And the repercussion of this being disrupted is profound, especially as we talk about next week, this symphony of walking and what happens when you walk. All right, so the environment, shoes, muscle strength, previous injury, genetics, all of these things interplay into this emergent pattern of walking. Now, I've never ever taken a step and said, all right, now as my foot goes into stance phase and rolls to pronation, Daniel, eventually I'm going to have to supinate. And all the while I'm pronating, I got to make sure that my tibia and my femur and my pelvis are doing all of these things. This is not a brain level thing. This is a physics and a gravity and a pendulum and a ground reaction force and a Newton's laws thing. This is not something that the brain is controlling. And now, again, at the beginning of the semester, we may have thought that the brain does everything all at once, but I don't think that it needs to do this stuff. So now the brain doesn't do everything anymore. The brain only needs to do what it needs to do when it needs to do it. All right. And I think that, what we have to do is take a look and see what are you working out in? Even though these Cortez shoes for cheerleading are pretty awesome, the shoes themselves have very thin soles, which makes it so that there's a pretty small base of support, which increases the ability to rotate. There's also very little arch support in these shoes too. All right, so what we want to do is we want to consider all of the factors that are leading to these overuse injuries, and I would argue that the injuries associated with walking, pronation, I don't think that they're overuse injuries. I think that those injuries are more explained by genetics, tendons, laxity, foot wideness, shoes, environment, and other aspects, as opposed to just saying that it's an overuse injury. Because if it's overuse, then everybody who bounces trampolines, everybody who does cheerleading, everybody who does hyper marathons should be injured, but they're not. All right, that's not the case. It's the individuals have poor genetics or weakened tendons or laxity or wideness of the foot or angles of the track surface or shoes that don't function properly or surfaces that don't allow for proper foot mechanics to occur. Those are the individuals who get injured. So I think that I can stop the screen share there and see if anybody has any questions about what we went over. But none of this is something that we can't predict or that we can't model, or that at the very least, if you walk and you're walking behind somebody, take a look at their foot, take a look at how their ankles, take a look at how wide their hips are, take a look at the way that their knees interact with the ground. Maybe consider the obesity and increased body forces and ground reaction forces on this chain of events. And now all of a sudden we have many different tools in our toolbox to make a hypothesis when somebody says they have ankle pain or knee pain. You don't just go back to the description of that pain and saying that you have an overuse injury. I firmly believe that the term overuse is a description, and the real explanation of this knee pain comes from the things that we've discussed, either imbalance in forces of the muscles or structural changes or environmental changes that are going to lead to a mismatch of biomechanics, kinesiology, or dissipation of forces. So I think that that's where we need to go today. Does anybody have any questions about what we went over? Jose, you've been on about 10 minutes. Anything you want to say, brother?
Nah, not right now, to be honest.
I hope you guys have a great day. Zach, John, Jasmine, enjoy your afternoon. Okay, nice to see everybody today.
Have a good one.
All right,
Have a good one.
too.
Go